Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ivanka Barzashka, and I'm the director of the King's Wargaming Network. The network aims to advance wargaming as a method of inquiry and as a method for learning and teaching. It is my pleasure to welcome you from London to the network's 5th public lecture on building the future of wargaming to usefully address contemporary security problems facing the UK, its allies, and partners. Good morning to those joining us from the United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. The network aims to advance wargaming as a method of inquiry. Good evening to those in Germany, France, Macedonia, Israel, and Singapore. It's my pleasure to welcome you from London to the network's 5th public lecture on building the future. Thank you all for being part of this Zoom webinar, and thank you for those joining us via the live stream on YouTube. It is my distinct honor to welcome Dr. Brad Roberts, who is streaming from Silicon Valley in California. And today we'll talk about the role of wargaming to out-innovate, out-think, and out-compete in a post-pandemic world. Today's event is part of a broader effort to adapt wargaming methods to the changed and changing strategic environment. We at King's founded the Wargaming Network 15 months ago as a reflection of intellectual humility at a strategic inflection point. A recognition that we need improved tools for understanding and addressing evolving security challenges in the face of uncertainty and technological and political change. So 15 months ago, we saw this inflection point as characterized by the return of major power competition alongside the more familiar threats posed by regional and non-state actors. Today, we see a global pandemic affecting every aspect of our societies and changing the strategic and international environment. These rapidly changing circumstances create new questions. What impact might the pandemic have on the most consequential new challenges in the strategic environment? What is required to outthink and outcompete adversaries? What kind of innovation is needed? And what could wargaming contribute? And how do we know if we've been successful? Dr. Brad Roberts will explore these questions from his perspective as an analyst and a US policymaker. He is currently the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California. Lawrence Livermore Lab is one of the premier American research and development institutions that applies science and technology to national security problems. Dr. Roberts has made important contributions to advancing strategic innovation at a time of atrophy in Western strategic thought. And under his leadership over the past 5 years, SGSR has broken new ground on many areas, including integrated strategic deterrence, major power competition, and also long-term competitive strategies. The center has successfully built the needed new communities of interest around these topics and energized the next generation of security and defense analysts. But more notably, Dr. Roberts has advanced strategic innovation through his own work. Prior to joining Livermore Lab, he wrote a book on the case for nuclear weapons in the 21st century. He did that as a senior fellow at Stanford University, and the book subsequently won the Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Title. It examined North Korea, Russia, and China and their thinking about conflict with the United States and its allies to conclude that their thinking went beyond strategies to what he termed red theories of victory. Dr. Roberts highlighted the need for corresponding blue theories of victory, or a set of coherent principles for overcoming the enemy. And this need has been recently validated by the US National Defense Strategy Commission, which described a crisis of American power. He has just completed a monograph called On Theories of Victory, Red and Blue, that will be published by Livermore as a Livermore paper, and this will be coming out next month. And the paper argues, among other things, that we need to make better use of wargaming techniques to test and refine these theories of victory. While he was in government, Dr. Roberts was a consumer of wargaming products. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy. And in that role, he was responsible for the development and implementation of 2 strategic reviews, and also for addressing the analytical requirements to implement the President's commitment to strengthen and adapt deterrence to 21st century security challenges. In his current roles, he regularly participates in strategic war games and advises the development of analytical work that uses war games as tools to both generate strategic insights, but also to increase strategic fluency among senior leaders. He's a member of the Strategic Advisory Group to U.S. Strategic Command. And in this and in other advisory capacities and advisory roles that he's engaged in, he's been actively engaged in the Department of Defense wargaming enterprise. Dr. Roberts has also served as a senior advisor to our work here at King's on strategic deterrence and gray zone conflicts. And this work resulted in the development of 2 new methods for analytical wargaming at the strategic level, to identify strategic problems and also to identify solutions to these problems. So it's an honor and a pleasure to have Dr. Roberts here today. But before I turn over to him, some words on the protocol for today's lecture. Many of you are joining us via Zoom, the Zoom webinar. So please type in your questions into the chat function, and I will be able to then select some of those questions and address them to Dr. Roberts when he concludes his remarks. And to those joining us on YouTube, please feel free to share your thoughts on the comments section in the video. Thank you very much. Brad, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ivanka. Thanks so much for this opportunity. Thank you for your kind and generous introduction. Thanks to everyone from 36 countries who's joining us for this discussion. I'm grateful also for the opportunity to trade away my face mask for a few hours and put on a coat and tie. I would like to start by congratulating you and your colleagues for your genuinely path-breaking work over the last 15 months. I've benefited personally greatly from my engagement. As you noted, I have some background in the gaming enterprise, both as a consumer in government and in my think tank lives. And I have to confess to have been a disappointed consumer. You made reference to the use we made of wargaming while I was in the Pentagon. It usually turned up important and useful insights for us, but it often left the main problem we were dealing with, which was escalation and de-escalation in my line of work, largely untouched. And similarly, in my prior experience before going to the Pentagon, when I was at the Institute for Defense Analyses for 12 years, working primarily on the problem of major theater wars against rogue states with WMD, the wargaming enterprise never seemed to quite get to the strategic problems that political and military leaders had to deal with. And now, to recall a phrase from Secretary Mattis about the speed of relevance, it's not clear to me that the innovations so far evident in the Western analytical community are keeping pace, that we are adapting at the speed of relevance. Part of what I valued about the King's wargaming work is that it begins with the premise that something has to change, that it's time for strategic innovation. And my purpose today is to help stimulate the thinking of the group about the nature of the needed innovation. My key questions are 4. First, in the pre-pandemic framework, what were the primary challenges to national security and international stability? Second, what impact might the pandemic have on those challenges? Third, what are the types of conflicts that we have to now be concerned about in the post-pandemic world as that arrives? And lastly, how must the practice of wargaming adapt to become more effective at generating insights useful to policymakers and military planners? I'd like to be clear up front that the views I'm expressing here are my personal views. I'm not speaking on behalf of the laboratory or any of its governmental sponsors. First question, in the pre-pandemic framework, what were the primary challenges? Well, the first and most obvious, you've already touched on, is the return to major power rivalry. From a perspective of the United States and many of its allies, we've been through a sea change over the last decade, a fundamental transformation in our view of the challenges in the security environment. For 25 years, 3 presidential administrations set out their view of cautious optimism about the trajectory of relations with Russia and China. And people recall the Obama administration as the most optimistic. I tend to believe it was the George W. Bush administration. Its national security strategy spoke about major power relations having entered a new, historically completely new period where we were able to shift away from the traditional sources of conflict and onto, quote, a foundation based on common responsibilities, common interests, and increasingly common values. That world seems light years ago. Obviously, the turn came with developments in the perceptions of President Putin that seem to have taken shape strongly in his second term, and his subsequent actions to use force to alter national barriers, to repudiate legal restraints on the development of capabilities and the exercise of force, to reject the European security order explicitly, and to reject the order as an instrument of encirclement and containment of Russia, has promised to, quote, snap back hard about that order, his commitment to new rules or no rules, and a lot of subsequent behavior that looks unruly. There was also a turn in China, where the leadership took a different view of the security environment and the opportunity. And beginning in the early 2010s, became much more militarily assertive in the maritime environment, undertook militarized land grabs of contested territories, also expressed an explicit rejection of the existing regional order, also saw it as an instrument of containment and encirclement, and made common cause with President Putin in building a different Eurasian order and contesting American influence, including with new forms of power projection outside of East Asia. The Trump administration is, of course, on the record in trying to distill this shift in the global security environment, and obviously put a significant emphasis on the renewal of major power rivalry, and in doing so gained broad bipartisan support. Because to a significant degree, the rivalry isn't new, it's the American discovery of it that's new. And that discovery really unfolded in the Obama period. We should recall that the reset with Russia, the reset button didn't work very long. And already in 2011, the administration was talking and pursuing the rebalance of the strategic posture to Asia to contend with a rising and increasingly assertive China. So this problem had clearly taken shape in the pre-pandemic environment, but it's not the only challenge, and let me highlight 3 others briefly. First, a nuclear arming North Korea, and the prospect of an Iranian nuclear weapon state to follow, or the possibility at least. This brings with it the age-old question in the nuclear proliferation business of a potential tipping point that leads to a, quote, cascade of proliferation, where we see not just a single state, but its neighbors proceeding to nuclearize. This problem has had already in the pre-pandemic world taken more salience than it had in decades past. Another challenge is, of course, the long war being waged by radical Islamist extremists against the West. With the defeat of Islamic State, this threat seems to be in retreat. It has certainly fallen off the radar screens of many policymakers, but this is an epical struggle and with significant lethal potential still, and one we ignore at our peril. And the last challenge I would highlight in the pre-pandemic security environment is the challenge of US alliances and adapting them and strengthening them for 21st century purposes, preserving them even. US alliances have come under increasing stress over the last 2 decades, not just in the Trump era. And a significant number of American allies in both Europe and Asia feel themselves to be under increasing pressure because they are in the crosshairs of, in the case of Northeast Asia, a nuclear arming Kim Jong-un. And they are the points of leverage that Russia and China seek to influence in breaking the existing regional security orders. So we have some anxious allies under new stress, and they fear abandonment by the United States, a fear that of course has grown in recent years. They feel a loss of American credibility that would weaken their protection. They fear being co-opted into large and contentious American projects, only to be abandoned when the US changes course. And they fear their own loss of strategic autonomy in regional orders no longer safeguarded by the United States and instead shaped and dictated by Presidents Putin and Xi. It's useful also to remember that these are potential tipping points as well in the nuclear puzzle, meaning the next potential cascade of nuclear proliferation could be among not rogue states, but among US allies or former allies who have found the need to protect themselves. This is a large challenge. When we catalog problems, we usually catalog threats. This isn't a threat, but if the alliance structure breaks down, we will find ourselves living in a very different security environment, all of us. So my answer to the first question, what were the pre-pandemic challenges, were these 4: major power rivalry, nuclear arming rogue states, the long war being waged by radical Islamist extremists, and the challenge of strengthening and adapting US alliances. My second question today is what might be the impact of the pandemic on these challenges? Of course, this is fundamentally unanswerable today, and all I can do is speculate. It's a fool's errand to try, but Ivanka's invited me to take on this fool's errand, so I will happily do so to lay out some arguments and elicit your reactions. First and most obviously, it's obvious the pandemic is going to have very many impacts on all dimensions of the environment in which we live, on the economy, on our social fabric, on our political processes, and of course on geopolitics and the security environment. These factors, well, let me say the following factors stand out to me as the most salient and cross-cutting. First and most obviously, a quick return to globalization and even free trade as we were practicing it seems unlikely for a significant period of time. Second, having exposed the weaknesses of many global institutions, there will then be an effort to fix things, to refurbish institutions, to lend them an additional intellectual, political, and physical capital. I fear that the results will likely disappoint us as we fall short. And of course, the epidemic is sharpening the ideological debate about who in the world has the best system. One of the attributes of major power rivalry that we've been slow to recognize in the West is its ideological character, as leaders in both Russia and China have increasingly articulated the argument that their model is not only best for them, but best for others. From my perspective, the biggest question about the impact of the pandemic from a global perspective is on what I shorthand as the hard landing, soft landing question. I think, all agree, which is of course hyperbole and an overstatement, but there's a broad view that we live in a security order that's eroding. And we debate how far it's gone and whether the liberal international order or the rules-based order or whatever we would like to label it to be, whether it's eroded, how significantly, is it going to collapse, has it collapsed? Let's look for an historical analogy for a moment. The 20th century, 3 distinct orders, all of which collapsed. The 19th century balance of power order collapsed into World War I. The League of Nations order, the Woodrow Wilson view of reflected in the Treaty of Versailles, that order collapsed into World War II. And then the Cold War collapsed in 1989 and 90. 2 hard landings, 1 soft. 21st century, how are we going to fare? Hard or soft? Are we going to find ourselves in a cataclysm we would have all thought inconceivable and unavoidable? Or will the order evolve through some sort of stable and peaceful competition? I find the parallels to the 1930s pretty troubling. In the 1930s, we saw revisionist powers in both Europe and Asia, whose leaders were resentful, fearful, and increasingly capable of pushing back. We see that today. We saw in the 1930s the failure of collective security and arms control. We see that today. We saw in the 1930s the weakening of norms and the rise of what one colleague calls strategic piracy. Powerful actors who flaunted the norms because it gave them standing to do so. We see that today as well. We saw an America that was isolationist, divided, and in a way willfully ignorant about what was going on in the world. And I'm sorry to say we see the same today, or at least segments of the body politic who think that way. And lastly, what we haven't had until now, there was a deep and global economic collapse, which of course we now have. Hard or soft? This seems to me to be the central question. And fundamentally, hard or soft will not be a function of jihadists or even rogue states, or even a collapse of the US alliance structure. Fundamentally, it will be a function of whether Russia, China, and the United States manage to escape war or become its victim. So let's look at the impact of the pandemic on the 3 major powers and relations among them. Before doing so, let me offer some brief remarks on the impact of the pandemic on the other 3 sources of the other 3 challenges. The impact of the pandemic on rogue states. North Korea could be devastated. On the other hand, we should recall that it survived a terrible famine in the 1990s. Millions died, the state went on. Iran too could be devastated. These could produce regime-changing outcomes in these countries. But on the other hand, we can see the opposite result. We can see the possibility of a worsening of their grievances about the world. After all, the US has opted not so far to ease the sanctions on Iran, which has impaired its recovery from the epidemic. The key question, it seems to me, is whether Kim Jong-un will see it as necessary, whether he will see necessity, opportunity, and acceptable risk in some form of opportunistic aggression. And there's a case that he might. If he faces a domestic political crisis of some kind, plus a significant rupture in US-South Korean relations, plus a clear signal that from the United States leadership that it's unprepared to defend the ROK in this instance. Secondly, the impact of the pandemic on alliances. Well, the impact of the pandemic on US allies might be to impair their ability to meet the 2% objective of defense spending growth. This will have some significant consequences on US attitudes towards allies. I suspect we already see increasing signs of resentment, new forms of resentment towards the American First strategy. We see a sharpening of anxiety about their potential loss of strategic autonomy as Russia and China exert their influence in this crisis. And I think it sharpens the question for them of where they would turn in extremis if the chips were really down. And if they turn to America to make good on its promise and we're not there, they're in deep trouble. So from my perspective, the epidemic is sharpening the anxiety that US allies feel and their sense of a crisis of confidence in the United States. And what about the impact of the epidemic on violent jihadi extremism? Not going to make it better. It's going to open up, it seems to me, new recruiting grounds, particularly as the epidemic sets in the Middle East and Africa. We can already see signs that social norms, political institutions, and security institutions are breaking down. This is a source of significant danger. But of course, let's not discount the impact of the epidemic on fanaticism at the other end of the political spectrum, or I don't know that ends of the spectrum fit this particular group of actors, from jihadis to right-wing extremists, populists, nationalists, nativists, racists, are all seizing and, to an extent, transnationalizing in this context. So, hard to make the case that the pandemic's going to improve this set of challenges. What about the impact on major power rivalry? Well, three questions here. What's the impact separately on the three? What's the impact on their rivalry? And what's the impact on the prospects for war among them? Impact on the three separately. Well, we can see the possibilities of both positive and negative impacts. We see people today talking about the possibility that the pandemic will have in Russia and China an ultimate political effect akin to what the Chernobyl incident had on the Soviet Union. The Chernobyl incident was a crisis that revealed that authoritarian government could not deliver its end of the basic political bargain in terms of the safety and security of the people, and would indeed lie to cover the human costs of its ineptitude and persist in doing so. This could lead to reform of a constructive kind and increased willingness to cooperate rather than compete. Similarly, in the United States, we can imagine the possibility that the pandemic will result in a washing out of our political system those voices that are anti-foreign, anti-expert, and anti-government. But we can imagine also the opposite outcomes. We can imagine that the next election returns, and even in the United States, returns and reinforces the basic instinct about walls and nativism. And we can imagine that Russia and China both seize on the opportunities, that the regimes in Russia and China seize on the opportunity to strengthen their control over their peoples. What about the impact of the pandemic on rivalry? Well, from my perspective, the pandemic has so far cast deep doubt on the capacity of our Western institutions, our economy, and our leadership class to engage in long-term competitive strategies. It's also clearly demonstrated the resolve of leaders in China and Russia to compete with the United States and to seize each crisis as an opportunity to further remake the world order. What about the impact on the prospects for war among the three? Well, here I think there's a best case, a worst case, and one other case to think about. The best case is that the three, perhaps because of internal domestic political change, rediscover some common interests and the virtues of cooperation and rebalance reset the dial that is constantly moving between competition and cooperation in relations among the major powers, rebalance towards cooperation. And there may be some rebuilding of international institutions and some pulling back from external confrontation. This to me implies the best case is reform, return to cooperation, or at least a more balanced, a better balance between cooperation and competition, and no war. The worst case, it seems to me, is that alliances are under serious strain and perhaps begin to fall apart. That the United States sends a clear signal that it's unwilling to defend the regional orders in East Asia or Europe that it helped to construct and safeguard. And that then there is some perceived need to act in Moscow and Beijing. So a need to act, probably from a domestic political context, an opportunity to act, and a calculus that the risk is acceptable because the United States has signaled its disengagement. So the worst case is opportunistic attack on a US ally by Russia or China for the purpose of demonstrating that US security guarantees are no longer viable in the 21st century. So I said a best case, a worst case, and one more case to think about, which I would call the plausibly bad case, which is the calculus of leaders in Moscow, Beijing, or Pyongyang, that there is a need and an opportunity, but too much risk in attacking directly a US ally. And that the need and opportunity focuses instead on some state that has or might have a security relationship with the United States, or some other interests that if attacked and not successfully defended by the United States will raise the same basic questions about whether the security orders dependent upon US commitment remain valid. And here it seems to me the plausible case is a Chinese effort to restore by force Taiwan to the People's Republic, or in the case of Russian actions in Ukraine or Belarus. So this was a long discussion of the impact of the pandemic. I think we're all trying to make sense of what the pandemic is going to mean for us in the future. My answer to the second question about the impact of the pandemic is that it might be positive from the perspective of these security challenges, but it's likely to be negative, and perhaps significantly so. It makes the hard landing more likely on a relative scale. On an absolute scale, still impossible to judge. My third question was, in the post-pandemic world, what are the types of conflict that might occur that we would potentially benefit from using wargaming techniques to understand? Well, I've already hinted at these, but let me list them. Five such conflict types. 1, opportunistic major power aggression not involving direct attack on an ally. 2, opportunistic major power aggression involving direct attack on an ally. 3, opportunistic major power aggression involving, opportunistic rogue state aggression involving a direct attack on an ally. 4, conflict in the gray zone. It's conflict. And 5th, an odd form of conflict, but ongoing and waged over goods in the security environment. And this is long-term strategic competition to alter the balance of power and influence. A different form of conflict, but one that's presented by this security environment. What's conspicuous to me is that 3 of these 5, the first 3, would involve regional conventional wars against a nuclear armed adversary, a problem that we have developed little attention to as it presents itself today, as opposed to the way it presented itself in the Cold War. As Ivanka indicated in her introduction, I've made the case that that Russia, China, and North Korea have developed a coherent set of ideas about how to deter and defeat the United States and its allies in a regional conflict that they would hope to keep conventional, but are prepared to engage in multi-domain or all-domain escalatory action for the purposes of blackmail, brinkmanship, and coercion. This is not the historical problem of unrestrained nuclear warfare, unrestrained general warfare. This is a theory of victory built on the idea that blackmail and brinksmanship will coerce America and its allies out of the conflict because we don't have a stake sufficient to accept the risk. As one Russian military expert put it, this is a theory of victory over the United States that involves attacks aimed at sobering us, but not enraging us to act with all of the power potential available to us. 4th and final question: how must the practice of wargaming adapt to become more effective at generating insights that about these conflicts that would be useful to policymakers and military planners? Now here too, let me set a little bit of context for this closing argument. The subtitle of the talk, as you know, is Innovating to Outthink and Outcompete. These are words taken from Secretary Mattis's 2017 National Defense Strategy. He described that as a strategy to, quote, compete, deter, and win. And in that strategy, he argued that in order to do these things, in order to compete, deter, and win, the United States and its allies must, quote, outthink, out-maneuver, out-partner, and out-innovate. And that he goes on to observe that the United States has struggled to do so after 3 decades of disinvestment in the capabilities, the people, the institutions, the tools needed to outthink, et cetera. So how have we done on outthinking? Well, Ivanka referenced the National Defense Strategy Commission. A word of explanation is in order. When the Congress levied onto the executive branch in 1994 the obligation to do a quadrennial defense review, which we now call National Defense Strategy reviews, the Congress also decided that it needed an advisory body of trusted agents, bipartisan, military expertise, many civilians, to advise it on the results of the review. So essentially the Congress would receive the QDR and hand it to the QDR Commission and say, we'll see you in 6 months. That's now the National Defense Strategy Commission. It received the 2017 Secretary Mattis-led National Defense Strategy, which included these phrases, and in November 2018 issued its report. It's available online. And let me just cite for you enough of the content to give you a flavor of its assessment. Although the National Defense Strategy, and I'm quoting, although the National Defense Strategy states that deterring adversaries is a key objective, there was little consensus among DoD leaders with whom we interacted on what deterrence means in practice, how escalation dynamics might play out, and what it will cost to deter effectively. Second quote, deterring and if necessary, defeating Russia's potential reliance on nuclear escalation to end a conflict on its own terms is both a particularly difficult and an extremely important operational problem. But DoD leaders had difficulty articulating how the military would defeat major power adversaries should deterrence fail. The United States needs concepts that account for an adversary's early reliance on nuclear means and the blending of nuclear, space, cyber, conventional, and unconventional means in its warfighting doctrine. The requirements of deterrence are significantly different today than during the Cold War or the early post-Cold War era. The Commission recommends a serious study of escalation dynamics. Next quotation. The United States must develop new operational concepts to achieve strategic advantage, including by addressing the ability of aggressive regimes to achieve a fait accompli against states on their periphery, or to use nuclear or other strategic weapons in ways that would fall short of justifying a large-scale US nuclear response. Two more quotes. The Defense Department does not appear to have a plan for succeeding in gray zone competitions. The National Defense Strategy asserts that the department will, quote, expand the competitive space, but it offers little evidence of how it will do so. And lastly, previous congressionally mandated reports warned that this crisis was coming. The crisis has now arrived, the crisis of American power. Should war occur, America will face harder fights and greater losses than at any time in decades. Put bluntly, the US military could lose. So other than that, we're doing fine. Anyone who's in the analytical business should recognize that this is a harsh judgment of the thinking that's been not done in the community. It's not a judgment of that. It's a judgment of the thinking that's been transported into the leadership ranks and digested and owned. This has something to do with the period of strategic atrophy to which Ivanka referred and to which the National Defense Strategy referred. And any of you conversant with the early history of the Cold War will remember all of the institutions that were built in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s, and the money that was spent to create the expertise we needed, to create the tools we needed, to create the analysis we needed to survive the Cold War and prevail. And we've been talking now about the new security environment for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. Where are the new institutions? Where's the new money? Where are the people? Well, there are a few, not many, not much reinvestment. And I would say the pandemic's likely to make further reinvestment even less likely. But what can wargaming contribute analytically to understanding these 5 types of conflict? Let me make seven potential contributions. First, wargaming can illuminate the ways in which potential adversaries have thought about and prepared for war with the United States and its allies, and the particular decision points that their actions might bring us to in conflict. Second, wargaming can illuminate the different potential courses of action for the United States and its allies at those decision points, and it can help to understand the calculus of benefit, cost, and risk at each decision point. Third potential contribution is to test and improve initial policy thinking about how to act in such wars. and the benefits and weaknesses of existing declaratory policy. Fourth, it can generate testable propositions and then test them from many different angles. Fifth, it can generate cumulative insight into complex problems. Six, it can inform the development of future capabilities. And lastly, it can help to create the needed communities of expertise that cut across all of these domains. So 7 contributions: illuminate, test and improve, generate, inform, and create. Different verbs attesting to the different roles that wargaming activities can play in the development of the analytical and intellectual community. But to maximize wargaming's contributions to meeting these particular challenges, to seizing these opportunities, some adaptations are needed. And I'll wrap up here. And I see five useful adaptations for this particular problem set. 1, to better understand the dynamics of regional conventional wars under the nuclear shadow, the gaming community needs to overcome the sharp divide between conventional and nuclear gaming, between cyber and everything else, between space and everything else. This is an all-domain problem. Regional conventional war under the nuclear shadow is an all-domain problem. If we only game parts of it, we're never going to come to terms with it. Russia and China don't think that way, game that way, and so long as we continue to balkanize the problem, we're going to get no closer to it. And nuclear gaming has been a taboo to most of the gaming community for a long time. Second adaptation. Most wargaming focuses on the operational level of war, where it has continued important contributions to make. But in these new conflicts, as the National Defense Strategy Commission has argued, the problems aren't primarily at the operational level of war, they're at the strategic level of war. The adversary is trying to jam us, to put us into a circumstance where we have to make a choice they want us to make. That's the characteristic of escalatory conflict. The gaming community needs to do a better job of understanding the decision environment that adversaries are trying to create. Third adaptation. Wargaming needs to adapt to become more effective in exploring conflicts not involving direct armed confrontation. The gray zone involves, and long-term competition are conflicts. They involve moves and counter moves and efforts to bring adversaries to critical decision points. And gaming has so far been underdeveloped. There used to be a sub-art called path games, which I find little familiarity with in today's gaming community. Fourth adaptation. In practice, there appears to be very little cumulative insight from a lot of ongoing work. We need some common map of the problem space on these 5 conflicts that I've identified, or the general problem of regional conventional war under the nuclear shadow. But we would derive benefit from together mapping out the main problems in this security environment and exploring them in a more systematic way than we've done. It's been too ad hoc and too disconnected. And this takes me to the 5th and final point, that in practice, there appears to be very little collective learning by the gaming community or its sponsors where they exist. The wargaming community doesn't wargame. Institutions wargame. Individuals wargame. There's very weak collective learning, and that slows our progress up the learning curve. We can't argue that we're going to get to the speed of relevance, to cite Mattis, on the current business model. So I see some new institution or process necessary. So briefly, in sum, I had 4 questions. Today's world brings us 5 particular problems in the security environment. Our intellectual house is not in order on these problems. Wargaming has something significant to contribute, but its success requires adaptation and more rapid adaptation. With that, Ivanka, I hope I put enough meat on the table for group discussion. Thank you again for the opportunity. I look forward to the next question.
Thank you, Brad, very much. We have about 25 questions. I will not take those in turn. For those of you that want to submit a questions, please do so through the Q&A button on your screen. And Brad, the first question is from Angus Gillian. In February of this year, former UK National Security Advisor Peter Ricketts voiced the view that some nations have lost the ability to make grand strategy. He said that the UK government should learn from Harold Macmillan's future policy study in reviewing policy commitments honestly. How can policymakers use the machinery of government to conduct forward-looking policy review? And how can they enact long-term strategy when the instant information age sees an overt focus on short-term deliverables?
Well, those are excellent questions. And I'm certainly the beneficiary of a lot of firsthand experience in government where process and advanced communication technologies have the wonderful effect of dumbing us down. I think part of the way the institutions of government fulfill their more strategic functions in the world we live in is by distancing themselves from the information environment and process and finding the time and the peace and quiet to think together. In the United States, every new administration is obliged to do a defense strategy review, a nuclear posture review, a national security strategy. And these are sometimes simply exercises in reciting everything that was said on the campaign trail or collecting the ideas of a few early political appointees who don't last very long often. But sometimes they're long and deliberative. And strategy can be developed and implemented in a deliberative way if leaders take the time to do so and empower the bureaucracy underneath them to implement. This is an important difference between the American and the British system, of course, is that we have a system where a president is the head of state is permitted to bring in a whole cast of characters with them, a few thousand. And this makes implementing a presidential agenda easier than it might be in other countries. But yes, I think there are reasons to be pessimistic about the ability of government to do these things, but I think it's possible if they set the priority.
Thank you. We have the next question by Anna Pacelli. So you said that due to the pandemic, the anxiety among allies is likely to grow about US commitments and security guarantees. In a post-pandemic world, what can the US government realistically do to address these fears in Europe and Asia?
Well, I think the beginning point is to recognize, for the United States to recognize that the alliance relationships it has serve its own interests, not just the interests of its allies, and help to provide a stable security environment that's in the interest of the international community generally, and even to an extent in the interest of those who push back about it from Moscow and Beijing. Treating our allies as if they are nothing more than, that they're just hiring us as mercenaries, weakens severely the political bonds that have tied us for decades. So I think the first step is to recognize the enduring value, at least in the current environment we live in, of our alliance relationships. Well, there are many other factors, but I think that's the starting point.
Thank you. And we have a question from Jordan. Are we likely to see the pandemic acting as an amplifier for the escalation of innovation and development of technologies that will be used as weapons of war? For example, artificial intelligence, robotics, disinformation practices, and cyber weapons.
Well, it seems to me we were already pretty accelerated on that pathway. Whether the pandemic, it seems to me the pandemic is likely to, on all things, have mixed impacts. And I would say for some countries, it's likely to have precisely the motivating factor that the question suggests. On the other hand, where would we think that might be so? Well, China and Russia, which are already deeply committed to the fullest possible exploitation of advancing technologies for these purposes, as is the United States. So I would say it's likely to make the pandemic itself is likely to have only a marginal impact, but potentially locally significant impact on the degree of interest in using advanced technologies for security purposes.
The next question is by Kira, who is pushing you to make a judgment on, out of the 3 post-pandemic cases you suggested, which of them do you think is the most likely?
So best case, worst case, plausible, bad case. Well, I think they're all plausible. I think the least plausible, though, is war involving an attack on a U.S. ally. I think opportunistic aggression is as plausible as the rosy scenario I offered. I think the rosy scenario is also, well, I think we're going to have a mixed result of the pandemic on all of these questions. People ask, what's going to be the big impact of the pandemic on the United States? Is it going to settle our debates about federalism and nativism and walls? And it seems to me it's not going to settle anything. It's going to stoke both sides of these debates. Our division will deepen. And I think that's a general proposition about the pandemic, that it's going to reinforce many divisions. And so I find it difficult to find the silver lining in this case. I think the plausible bad case is probably the most likely of the 3, but I wouldn't place a huge bet on that.
Thank you. So we'll now turn to a series of questions that are coming in on your views on wargaming. We have a question from Peter Perla on how and where would you envision creating the sort of institution you recommended, one charging with assimilating and disseminating the broader insights from wargaming?
Well, I haven't thought that far into it. I'm not sure it's a single institution. I think it's, well, from a US perspective, the starting point, it seems to me, has to be some institution that can bridge between the government and private sectors and academia, and some institution that can contribute to what's going on inside government at the classified level, but also participate in a leading way in the work of other institutions that don't work with that kind of information. From my perspective, in the American system, that means federally funded research centers, like RAND or the Institute for Defense Analyses, for example. And but I can't imagine a single institution taking this on for the global community. I think it's a networking activity, and I think there need to be fora that allow the expert community to come together and share their thinking and collectively work over an extended period of time on a common puzzle.
So this question has also been echoed by Pat McKenna, who said, in your fifth point regarding adaptations in wargaming, you suggested new institutions, and could you please elaborate?
So are you giving me a second shot at my answer to the question?
It's a popular question.
Well, I would say, so investments in, I'm not sure we have the critical mass of activity underway that could be drawn together collectively by some new organization sitting in the center that motivates it all somehow. My first thought is that the investments that are needed today are in existing institutions and bandwidth, meaning we need more people engaged in this kind of work. We need more policymakers interested in asking questions about this work and safeguarding the processes, stewarding them over a decade or two or three, rather than looking for the near-term budget activity and short-term policy payoff. So I'd start with institution building before building a new institution.
We have a question from Mark Barton, saying that wargaming has become associated with either conducting major defense reviews or validating capability development rather than being part of a decision process. If you agree with that premise, how could wargaming be adjusted to become part of a more rapid decision-making process?
So that's mostly consistent with my impression. And the countering model is the one that I think began to take shape as a result of the initiative by the US Department of Defense. Then Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, was it 2016, Ivanka, or 2017, issued the, no, it was back in 15.
2015.
Issued guidance to the department to up its game on wargaming and embed it in an improved analytical process. And I think the activity that then followed was, as I understand it, well tailored to the solution I have in mind, meaning there was an effort to build cumulative insight into a problem across the defense community, to utilize multiple analytical tools in trying to better understand the puzzle and its pieces, and to tailor the use of wargaming so that it tested or validated some of the results of the other tools. And the whole package then would present to the senior decision maker a set of choices aligned with the analysis, choices about capability development or strategy development or crisis management. I think that's a good model.
We have another question from Jacopo Grande on strategic decisions and ethics. And if wargaming has to explore gray zone scenarios of conflict, how can wargaming be more effective in considering ethical aspects and strategic decisions?
Well, but how can it become more so? By bringing that expertise to the table, by bringing people who think in those ways about those things. I would say this goes to my point about the decision environment. When it comes to making decisions in an escalating war under the nuclear shadow, there are going to be more and more political types at the table and fewer military types, because the large questions then in discussion will be about what will be the impact of this choice on the peace to follow, what will be the lesson that it teaches to history, what is the legal and moral obligation falling on the United States and its allies at this particular moment, and how do we choose a course that we can defend to the world as proper, righteous, and necessary. So it seems to me the moral question will be at the core. It will be one of the questions at the core of decision makings about how to act in an escalating regional crisis under the nuclear shadow. So that obliges the gaming community to bring to the table people who understand that intersection of military choice, political context, and moral logic.
A question from Josh. Do key stakeholder communities agree that there's an opportunity to use and support the growth of wargaming? And do they recognize the need for an integrated campaign of analysis that includes wargaming?
Well, the they in that sentence is a big group. Do they recognize the need? I think there's, in my limited experience of engaging with U.S. allies on these questions, I find lots of evidence of urgency and action to improve and, where necessary, develop new tools for analytic work on the new security environment. There's a discussion in many allied capitals about the use of wargaming. There's a discussion in many allied capitals about how to improve or adapt net assessment methodologies to fit the problem of strategic competition in the 21st century. There's a discussion of how to become more effective consumers of intelligence products to know what the right questions are to ask. In the United States, we have, at best, we have a system that produces at best episodic interest in anything. By that I mean, in our military community, we have turnover every 3 years. And so there may be interest. A new commander, for example, may arrive at Stratcom and be very enthusiastic about this kind of work. But 2 to 3 years later, there's a new person in place who has a different set of priorities. We see less turnover on the joint staff, but it's still there, and there is an abiding interest there in the strategic use of wargaming tools. And in the civilian ranks, of course, we see steady turnover among the political appointees. So it's very difficult to sustain the focus of the US government on any particular topic such as this. But I believe that there is a clear, steadily rising interest in the problems identified, the analytical problems identified by the National Defense Strategy Commission, and in the tools needed to help provide better answers.
A question from Cecil Haney. How should academic institutions worldwide, like universities, adapt to ensure student critical thinking is more adaptable to the strategic wargaming you describe, especially to develop the necessary skill sets to move toward the adaptations that you've mentioned? Will this require understanding of technology, science, policy, history, and other disciplines more broadly? And his comment is that universities are generally divided into specific disciplines, and is this going to work to generate more innovation in thinking and subsequently strategic wargaming, or do we need change in university structure? Or are there examples of success that you've seen?
Well, thank you, Mohani. Excellent question. And let me offer 2 lines of argument. First, in most countries, the dividing line between academia and government is wide. They don't speak the same language. They don't have the same values generally. This has given arise to the need for mediating institutions that can sit in the middle. And if you will, this is sort of the function of think tanks in the American political system. They find the sources of ideas in society, draw them together, and translate them in ways that are useful for the policy community. I think there are changes that academia in the United States needs to make, and I'll come to that as my second point. But we need to recognize the value of these mediating institutions, whether they're federally funded research centers, which are private entities, they're not government entities, but they're federally funded, or whether they're the not-for-profit think tanks, where I think, and their capacity to play the role that I would envision for them in this new strategic environment is constrained by the funding available to them. So the change that's needed for their capacity is change that comes from their sponsors, who have by and large gone off in search of other problems to solve. The second line of argument I'd make is that the heavy emphasis of the American educational system on politics as science, as a topic that can be explored by quantitative means, has produced lots of great insights and value for our society, but it misses a lot that's important in the realm of conflict and peace building. And it seems to me that the European model, well, the King's College model, the premier war studies program in the world, is a model to which the United States should aspire. A pathway to the multidisciplinary study of conflict and how to reduce it and ameliorate it and eliminate it, and how to win it if it comes to that, or at least manage it. These are all ongoing questions of discourse at King's. They're questions that should be directly relevant to the interests of policymakers. And we don't really have comparable models in the United States. So I would argue for not a reconstruction of the overall American academic process, but for the opening up of studies of realms of politics and conflict that are less conducive to understanding by quantitative means.
I have a question from Alia. What do you think should be done to bring more female leaders from across sectors to wargaming efforts?
Well, I'm not particularly that there's a need to bring more female leaders. I find plenty of them in the rising generation. The wargaming enterprise, like so much of the study of security and war and peace in the 3 decades after the Cold War, suffered significantly. There weren't career pathways. I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in 2003 to give a lecture. The Fletcher School has approximately 200 students in the master's program, and 70% of them were female. How many of them went on to find opportunities in the security sector? Very few. How many of the young men went on to find opportunities in the security sector? Also very few. There were no opportunities in the security sector. And it seems to me that the rising generation of scholars and the academic programs producing them are as diverse a group as we could hope for. And my hope is that there are career pathways that open up in front of all of you, because in my experience, you're doing extremely thoughtful and path-breaking work.
A question from Jordan. As someone who works in the private sector as a research analyst, he can confirm that there's significant desire to understand future threat forecasting, but the experience is lacking. So how can we begin to transpose wargaming expertise across sectors, public and private?
Well, that's an excellent question. And again, I think it's a sponsor-driven question. Someone in the private sector, most famously historically Shell, but private sectors need to recognize their interests and equities here. Here, since Ivanka reminded you at the start that I'm standing in Silicon Valley, let me just give a data point from Silicon Valley, which is, of course, the high-tech firms here engaged in, felt they had their fingers burned by the Snowden affair, that they were found to have engaged in activities that were deemed politically unpopular at best, or just wrong-headed. And they tried to retreat from the entire policy realm of the national security enterprise. Now, what we've seen is many of them conclude that's more likely to get them in a situation in the future that serves them ill. They need to do more to better understand the external environment in which they operate, and they need to do more to understand the way in which their technologies impact national security and the broader security environment, and they need to do more to understand why their employees feel the way they do and what their employees feel about these things. And essentially, their big question is, what's their social responsibility when it comes to the impact of their technologies on the security environment? This seems to me to be a market sector where gaming techniques should be seen to be useful. But I think the only way to broaden the use of gaming techniques is for people in those other sectors to recognize that there's a need that can be filled by this particular approach.
A question from Karim Gonzalez. I will rephrase. So do you see a role for non-obvious outsiders in making contribution, either as wargame players or wargame designers? In other words, should we be wargaming with senior leaders, or can we generate insights from the broader public?
Gosh, I'd say both and everyone. The more, what a good game should help bring out is the things that are in a leader's control and the things that aren't, and all of the wild cards that emerge along the way. Every new day is a roll of the dice, and it seems to me the more that can be done to inject the chaos that is reality into the wargaming enterprise. Not all the time, because there are probably certain problems you want to be able to just select out and study in the most focused possible way. But I think there's good benefit in bringing, quote, non-obvious outsiders into the gaming enterprise.
Question from Josh. One concern is that despite numerous on-the-record sound bites on the effectiveness of wargaming, including by senior leaders, and on how much more is required, the actual take-up of rapid wargaming techniques has been limited. So how do you suggest that the situation be improved?
Well, part of the answer goes to the bandwidth question earlier, the investment by sponsors in the institutions that do this kind of work to improve and sustain their capacity to do it. But secondly, I think it takes some leading institutions to step up and play a continuing role with a demand signal. And in the United States, it seems to me this should be both the Joint Staff and Strategic Command. I see no reason that it couldn't also usefully be the regional combatant commands where these issues are significant, EUCOM and PACOM. Seems to me NATO could be sending a demand signal that it hasn't actually sent clearly to this community. So I see this as a demand signal function issue.
So you talked a lot about the US context. We have a question from Enrico on wargaming in Asian countries. Is that there's a bureaucratic tendency to avoid any activity that would expose them to do the wrong thing, and that would seem embarrassing in front of superiors and peers and subordinates. So what do you think would be the best way to introduce wargaming to risk-averse governmental institutions? And should this be done via universities or government agencies?
Well, I should say it should be done by both, and both will encounter their own set of obstacles. I have to say, my experience doesn't correspond with that of the questioners, which means we've just had different experiences. But my experience is, and I've done a lot of gaming activities with Japanese, South Korean, and Australian colleagues, and I don't find the problems you've identified. I found, in fact, a striking forthrightness that, once you think about it, isn't at all surprising, because it flows from the sense of urgency that they bring to the table. When you feel you're under the gun, particularly the nuclear gun, it has a clarifying effect on ideas and the urgency of coming to some substantial counters to the threat. So where it does exist, I think then I mean, government leaders, government officials, junior staff officers are always going to be reticent to engage in public activities that might be received elsewhere as signs of weakness or appeasement or stupidity. So there has to be an appropriate balance between activities that are conducted behind closed doors and discussed behind closed doors, and those that are shared with the community more broadly in the way of key insights and conclusions.
So it's 6:30 p.m. here in London. Brad, I'll turn over to you to any concluding remarks that you may have before I say a few words to finish today's event.
Thanks, Ivanka. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for your leadership in putting together the network and the public lectures and all of the associated activities. Thank you for being a pathbreaker on adaptation. And thanks to all of you who joined us this morning for your persistence through a 90-minute session, electronic. And thank you also for everything you do to advance our collective effort here.
Well, Brad, thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you as part of our community today. From your remarks, it's clear that wargaming can make a significant contribution to understanding the post-pandemic security challenges and potential responses, but that to do so, we must continue to innovate. From our perspective at King's, as the King's Wargaming Network, we see innovation requiring an environment where the best ideas can flourish regardless of where they come from. So that's why we aim to bring together different communities, academics, policymakers, and professional wargamers. And we see that these efforts over the last 15 months have generated a lot of interest, but also a lot of diversity in gender and in education and in ways of thinking to this new problem. And of course, this builds on a long history of King's wargaming activities. We've had a master's module, so a full year course on wargaming since 2003. We've engaged in wargaming design and analysis on war games at the strategic level since 2015, and we look forward to building and growing this capacity. And finally, let me turn over to our fantastic team that we have at King's, that is helping make every event a success. And if I can ask James, Francesco, and Anna to please switch on your cameras. So you know Anna Nettleship, who's the coordinator of the Wargaming Network, and Anna is one of the people at King's who's working on a PhD that will be developing and applying new wargaming techniques. We have James Smith, who is our naval wargamer, also completing a PhD, and he is also leading on our social media and outreach strategy. James, I don't know if you can turn on your camera. And we have Francesco Ragazzi, who's having trouble with his camera, but Francesco has been part of our team for since we launched on the strategic wargaming work at King's, and has documented the development of the Wargaming Network. Francesco is an Italian documentary photographer, so a lot of the visuals that you see are the product of his creation. So he has the challenging task today to document a live webinar. So we'll see what that produces. So once again, thank you all for joining us from 36 countries and 4 continents. And please stay in touch. Thank you, Brad.